Okay, we're good to go, Dom.
We are live. So, hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. We want to welcome you to a very special collaboration edition of The Huddle in partnership with our good friends of sports industry influencers and minorities in sports business. For those of you who are new, my name is Dominique Olavito, and I am the host and co founder of The Huddle. A bit about myself: I live in Los Angeles and I work as a creative executive within the sports industry. In my role, I oversee everything from content development, creative strategy, and content production, with various clients in this industry. And my work spans across professional athletes, leagues, players associations, and major brands. And I will kick it over to my co-founder, Paul, to introduce himself.
What's up, everybody? Thanks again for being here. My name is Paul O'Connor. Like Dom said, I'm the co-host of The Huddle, as well as the Director of Business Development at Kids in the Game. Kids in the Game is a sport-based youth development organization based in New York City, and I oversee our school and community partnerships. About 2 months ago, Dom and I created The Huddle, and what The Huddle is all about. It's an online community that was created during COVID in efforts to bring together the basketball and larger sports community. Each week we welcome guests from different sectors of the business to come on and share their stories and educate others on their areas of expertise.
And to be fully transparent, with the state of our country and our dedication to the Matter movement, we knew that this episode tonight, wasn't the opportunity to just bring another guest on to talk about their career. We wanted to use the platform that we've created to elevate the voices of our peers, partner with our peers, and bring people together to have a difficult and necessary conversation around race. In response to the violence and murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and the countless other Black lives taken by police brutality, we have all been forced to reassess the role that race plays in our daily lives. And through this event, we want to spark a nationwide conversation around the impact of race in sports business. All of us collectively on this panel believe that progress begins by uncovering and discussing the ways that race impacts our industry. So tonight, we're going to cover some topics like the employee experience, corporate accountability, and allyship. And ultimately, it's going to be the actions of all of us on this call that will lead to sustained change in this business and beyond. And, if you're new here, this event tonight is for everybody in our sports community who's committed to unity, progress, and action. And we hope you all will benefit from further perspective on these issues.
Yep, well said, Dom. Yeah, I mean, look, this is about providing a platform to amplify the voices of others, to discuss real issues, examples, and stories. This is about listening, taking action, and making real change. We want to activate in an area where we can immediately take action, and that's in our field of work. We want to get real about the role of race in sports business and shed light on issues happening in the workplace. We know that this isn't a conversation that gets solved overnight, but we believe that this is a step in the right direction. Both Dom and myself are dedicated to actively engaging, learning, and listening, and using our privilege and voices to make space for others. Our hope is that this conversation would be ongoing, and we know it can be uncomfortable, but it's essential. So, with that being said, I'm going to kick it to our awesome panelists tonight to introduce themselves. And, Malcolm, we can start with you.
Awesome. Thank you. And appreciate you hosting this forum. I think it's a really important and timely conversation. And a lot of people are trying to direct their energy in terms of how to respond to everything happening in the fight against racial discrimination, when the truth is we need to start at home and within our businesses, and we see it day to day. So appreciate that. Myself, I am Malcolm Ruffin, founder of Sports Industry Influencers. We strive to close the diversity, equity, and inclusion gap prevalent in the business of sports and entertainment. We do that by connecting minorities and allies of diversity, equity, and inclusion through programming. We've hosted a lot of events, and we really just tried to build community and also help people of color advance. My personal background is from Chicago, worked at the NBA with Dom for a number of years. And then I just graduated from Harvard Business School, and I'll be going to CAA in a month as head of athlete content strategy. But beyond all of that, first and foremost, I'm a Black man in America, and this issue is something that I'm extremely passionate about.
Thank you, Malcolm. Shina, you want to introduce yourself next?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Shina Wheel, and I am the founder of the Minorities in Sports Business Network. Similar to sports industry influencers, we're an organization that seeks to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion within the sports business space. We have over 1,000 members of color across the country, and we're first and foremost just a community and a safe space for people of color. But we connect people with jobs, and we also work with college students to help delete some of the barriers that they may find to enter the sports industry. Oh, and in terms of my background, I've been in sports for about 12 years. I've worked with ESPN. I've worked within the NBA family. I have done some work with athletes as well as some agencies like Global Hue and Endeavor and a few other agencies. So I've kind of been all over the place.
And tell us about your new role, Professor Shina, should I say?
Oh, yes. So in the fall, I will be teaching sports comms at Georgetown University as well as West Virginia University. So to any students who may be tuning in, we look forward to that. And I will be teaching about how to cover stories correctly, fairly, looking from all angles and not just from one view. So look forward to that.
Yeah, big clap.
Yes, amazing. We're so proud of you.
Thank you, friends.
And Vince?
Hello, everyone. Vince Pearson. I've got my own consultancy focusing on diversity and inclusion. I choose to focus in sport, but essentially coming in and providing high-level strategy development on a micro, executing against that strategy, education and training, but also with a focus on cultural competence. My background, I've worked in sports for about 10 years now, with the last 7 or so being in diversity and inclusion. I got to sit next to Dr. Richard Lapchick during my graduate experience and work on some of the racial and gender report cards. And that's when I really started to hone my interest and passion for not just sport, but for the impact of sport. And so diversity and inclusion has been the lane that I've been able to activate within. And so now I do that independently now.
It's amazing. So as you all can see, we put together quite a squad for tonight. And thank you all again for joining us. We have so much to cover tonight, so we will get right into it. First topic that I want to really shed light on is just the overall industry reaction to the Black Lives Matter movement. You know, what are your thoughts on this overall industry reaction, and what hasn't been as positive or effective, and why? Shina, we'll start with you.
So personally, I am proud of all the companies that, you know, came out right away and said something, and they didn't wait, they didn't wait to have a response to see how other people would react first. So shout out to those companies. But my biggest question has always been and is, what are y'all doing internally? Because to put out these Black Lives Matters, statements to support the Black community, I've seen a lot of donations that are happening, but if we were to sit back and take a look at home, what are your employees saying about working there? What are your employees of color saying about working there? So that's been my question to the larger community. It's like donations are great, but the reality is, a lot of that stuff is already kind of budgeted for the year. So, the reaction has been dope. It's been great to see. It's been disappointing for some of the companies who have been a little bit milquetoast and generic with their statements. But shout out to the companies who specifically talked about Black Lives Matter and wanted to make a change and a difference and be involved.
Malcolm, what about you? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, for sure. I definitely feel like a lot of companies had vague cookie cutter type language about unity, or don't even explicitly talk about police brutality and violence or racial discrimination. And so I think that that's very clear that if those companies aren't even committed to facing those issues in their corporate statements, they definitely aren't trying to do the hard work to disrupt those structures internally. It's hard to find those office cultures or recruiting processes or performance review policies that do have racial bias ingrained in them. And so I think that, as Shaina said, some companies were very explicit, some companies had actions that followed, and I think that that's very clear that they're more likely to succeed than those that can't give vague statements. I think that and we can talk a little bit more about some examples that some companies that did do well. For my employer, CAA, beyond going there, they actually had, I believe, one of the strongest statements because it was backed by action. They came out publicly, but then they also promoted or had someone of color. They had Lisa Joseph Medalist was promoted to the board of the entire agency, one of the premier sports entertainment agencies in the world, and she's going to now have a seat at the table. That's a difference maker. And so I think that you can tell the companies that are committed to action and the companies that are just looking at this as a wave. And as Shaina said, it's popular to say this. Okay, we'll say this. We'll put this out, or it's safe now. So I think that you can tell the real from fake.
Yeah, well said. And good transition to our next question as well. Want to talk about performative activism or slacktivism, as some would say. When companies are forced to confront racism, the responses are often predictable. Like you mentioned, a lot of people just put out cookie cutter statements or what other companies did. How can we hold these companies or people responsible for these messages accountable? Vince, we can start with you.
I think we create accountability by doing things like this, right? We're having a conversation around it, and we're going to be critical. We're going to keep an eye on what you said. We're going to want to see the proof of what you said you were going to do. And we're going to go beyond that. If you really care, then we're going to expect more from you moving forward. I think that pressure comes in a lot of different ways. The protesters that's a form of pressure. The looting that's happening, it creates a form of pressure. An individual who may stand up in a staff meeting and say, hey, I'm disturbed that this group hasn't had this conversation before. That creates pressure. And what's different, at least for me, when I just sit in the moment and feel this movement, I think what's different is that it seems like each of these different lanes are filling up, and we're creating pressure from a lot of different angles. I've been on the inside of an organization when a Black life has been taken in the street unarmed by police. And it feels much different today than it has in the past. Just around the momentum that this has carried. I mean, here we are, 2 or 3 weeks removed from the incident that sparked a lot of conversation, and it feels like this is evolving. So I think the key is to keep that pressure, and for everybody to do it in their own way. Some folks are going to be really sophisticated and strategic. Some folks are just going to go wild out. Everybody has a role to play, and I think that is how we're going to apply pressure to start to create accountability.
Yeah, well said. Shaina, how about you?
Yeah, I echo Vince's statements in terms of accountability. I want to see what you're doing a year from now. And not just that, I felt like with a lot of the statements, they were vague in terms of the actions that were being taken. So if you are a bank that's saying that you are going to partner with HBCUs, which, to be honest, I feel like is a lazy statement, because it's quick and easy to say, like, we're just going to partner with HBCUs, knowing that not all Black students go to HBCUs. So it's like, how are we going further than that? Because that's just an easy thing to say right now because it's a sexy term. But also, what are these partnerships looking like? Are you going, when you're providing jobs, are these only going to be at bank branches? Are we looking at corporate sides? So that's what I want to see. I want to see what the action that's going to be taken. I want to see how deep you're going and how surface level you're going to take.
Yeah, and again, segueing us into our next question, like both of you said, at the end of the day, action needs to be taken to back these statements up. And I think this time specifically, like that's something that people are really going to be paying attention to and looking out for. So, you provided some examples, Shina, but what would real action look like, and what are some examples? Malcolm, we'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, and I think just to kind of close out the last question, I do think that this is going to be different because these statements, whether the companies realize it or not, this is evidence. And so a year from now, 5 years from now, no matter how vague these statements are, they're going to have to be held accountable. And so I think this Twitter is one of my favorite kind of avenues of Twitter. And so the fact is that I feel pressure comes in three primary forms. It comes internally from employees and leadership. If they have a point of view they can push, it's the public perception. And that's really what has shifted, right? The public is now on a different side of Black Lives Matter. And now, and that's provided a lot of pressure and has financial implications if a company isn't on the right side of that history. And also it comes from pressure from stakeholders, whether that be the athletes in the NFL case, right? They're forced to respond because a main stakeholder, the athletes, was disgruntled and voiced it, right? And so I think that pressure is going to create a lot of accountability from all of those sides, and we have to keep applying that pressure. We have to keep staying loud. I think that the one example I gave was of CAA and Lisa Medalist. Joseph Medalist was a great example, but I think that in general, these companies need to have people of color and diversity across all spectrums at a senior leadership level. Because instead, what they're doing now, they're scrambling because they don't have people of color in senior positions. And so now they're like, we're the Black people, we need their feedback on this, right? And now you have Black people that are traumatized because of what is happening in the world, already struggling to do that. It's hard to even focus on your day job. And now you're also asking them to lead the charge on diversity, equity, and inclusion of systems that have been complained about for decades, but you ignore the warning signs, right? So instead, you need senior leadership to be diverse. And then you'll have across all different areas. And then you already have the people in place to do the work.
Yeah, that reminds me of like the meme that's been shared across social media that's like, thank you for your Black Lives Matter post. Now, please share with me a photo of your executive leadership team. Vince, what are your thoughts?
You're right. And you can't help but chuckle when you hear that, right? I think what I would consider to be legitimate action in this moment is for companies and for those of us who are in position to create pressure to encourage some really specific action that focuses on anti-Black racism. We're seeing what that looks like in society at its peak. Like we saw the most egregious of incidents. And unfortunately, we see those kind of cyclically when you think about our history. But let's do some research on what that looks like within the four walls of our corporation. Let's not start there in a lazy way by, like Malcolm suggested, let's find our senior most Black people and say, hey, we got a new job for you because you're probably already doing 3. Let's not do that. Let's not be lazy. Let's find people who specialize in this. And you can do that quietly. I'm not saying that you need to say, hey, look, we found all the ways that we're racist and we're going to tell the world, but do it authentically. Do it in a way that you get real information and then act against it. If you learn that 10% of your employees are Black, but 50% of your poor performers are Black, you've got a situation here where you got 2 possible options. Either 1, Black people cannot do the job, or 2, you've got bias in the system. And if you tell me that Black people can't do the job, then throw the hope that we've got a whole nother set of issues that are going to be unearthed with that. So I think a real approach that focuses specifically on this moment. That's one of the frustrating things for me in diversity and inclusion. It becomes all things to all people, and you have these incidents, and before you know it, you're creating programs for white males to get mentored into executive positions because it's got to be open to everyone. Take advantage of this moment to be specific against the issues that exist and find out what that looks like in your company.
Yep, that's good. Shina, anything else to add on that question or topic?
Yeah, so I think one thing that we're going to see is going to be this burst of D&I roles open up, right? We're going to start seeing D&I teams pop up at every company. Cool story. If that happens at your company, put some tangible benchmarks behind that. Do not just hire Black people to do these D&I roles just to have a face, just so you can put on your little corporate slide that, look, we have a Black person in a C-suite level position as our chief D&I officer. Have people who are going to come in and give them actual work to do. Do not just send them to all the panels and all the lunches and all the galas so you can have a statement there and say company X has a diversity and inclusion team. Put some actual benchmarks. Let's have some percentages out there so we know a year from now, we can see the work that they did and allow them to actually do that work. So if you have people who are putting together strategies for your company, let them do that. And similar to what Malcolm said, don't put that burden on people who already have jobs because you're only paying them for one. And I think that's probably happened to all of us in here, where it's, you know, a lot of us have been asked to do D&I work, or can you check out this D&I company for us, or can you sit on this meeting? I'm not being paid to do D&I work. I'm getting paid to do this specific role. So if you want me to do D&I work, you need to increase my salary and change my scope of my role. So I'll leave it at that.
And with that, so I wanted to add, and I had to, is just, if we look back at this moment in time, a year from now, and we've got a lot of new diversity, equity, inclusion professionals who used to be marketing professionals or who used to be communications or on the revenue generating side, then we will have failed in this moment. Especially if they're people of color. We need those people to stay in, especially the revenue generating roles. So when you're pulling people out of a chief revenue officer track and putting them onto this chief diversity officer track, if it ever even graduates to that, it's a disservice to the work and it's a disservice to the person who was on a track that we need them to stay in.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I wanted to really reiterate Vince's point about revenue driving roles. And I think that that's something that a lot of people don't talk about because we don't know. There are not a lot of people of color in revenue driving roles, especially in senior revenue driving roles. And those are the roles that, one, make the most money. They are the most valuable to a company, and those people are less likely to be let go. So please put more, as Vince said, don't take those people out of those roles to come do your D&I work. Find people who actually have that background and can come in and do it correctly.
Absolutely. And you always segue us perfectly into, our next topic, which obviously there's a lot of reaction to the Black Lives Matter movement over the last few weeks. And we just talked about, in this last section, how to really take action and not just make it a PR stunt. But there's specific history here, like what you just mentioned, Shina, that needs to be talked about, specifically to the workplace. So can you share just the experience of a Black employee in sports? Specifically, what is it like to be a Black employee in your specific vertical? Malcolm, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think that topic of segmented diversity, it cannot be emphasized enough. It's very clear in this industry that there are certain roles that Black people and people of color are kind of allowed to do, right? They're allowed to be in sponsorship servicing roles. They're not allowed to necessarily be in sponsorship sales roles. They're allowed to be in, if you look at the Institute for Diversity and Ethics in Sport, TIDES, which at the UCF report by Dr. Lapchick, you can see that you can see where the diversity and inclusion numbers sit. What we don't see is that a lot of those VPs of color, a lot of whatever the titles are, they might be in basketball operations or they might be in player development or something, right? They're allowed to interact with players and the talent, but they aren't necessarily to be in those revenue driving roles, as Shina said. And so I think the topic of segmented diversity is something that I experienced. And that's partially why I felt the need to go to business school, was to kind of break out of that stigma. And so I think that's very, very much a big issue.
Definitely. Shina, what about you?
Sorry, I think just to speak specifically about kind of the industry I'll be going into and focus on content, this industry profits and benefits off of Black talent and Black culture. And the fact is that there are a lot of companies that are for the culture, but the people pushing the buttons, all their content producers, all their social media people are not people of color.
Mm-hmm.
And so I have several examples in my mind, but I think that they don't necessarily, they value Black culture, but they don't value Black talent. And I think that's something that's very real, especially in the content space.
Absolutely. As someone who works in production, it's like we've talked about this specifically, Malcolm. You walk onto a set and you'll be, creating something for an athlete, and then it's an entire team of, white men who are not even, in touch all the time with even what they're filming. It's just to fill the job. And I think specifically in production, you want your stories to be raw and authentic, and you have to bring in, a diverse crew to do that and to tell those stories. Shina, can you share your experience?
Yeah, and I would even say, to add on to that, I think, especially within the athlete space, a lot of athletes are being very more vocal about the types of people that they want to see on their teams. And to that point, which kind of goes into some of my experience, I would really like to see some of these agencies and these companies stop choosing Black people specifically for that reason alone. If you're not going to let them sit in on the pitch process and help you craft the pitch, and only ask them to come on because you need a Black face in the room, because Black athlete X is going to relate better to that Black person, but they have no idea what the pitch is because you asked them to come through this morning, that's a problem. And that's something that's happened to me. So I have had examples of both overt and covert examples of racism. I've been at one of the larger spaces within the sports. Sorry, Tropicana is really passionate right now.
Yeah.
It's all right. But I've been in one of the spaces where, wearing braids to work and having someone ask me if I wash my braids with bar soap, asking someone, questioning my sports knowledge, or why am I working there? Am I only here, we can curse, right? But am I only here to fuck players? Things like that. Whereas like my other coworkers have never had those questions. Or, I've definitely been on the side where it was like, oh, Shiny, we need you to come on this pitch with us. There was a company that I worked for that was pitching BET for one of their summer events. Anybody who has worked on anything BET for a lot of their summer events, that the target audience there is Gen Z. I'm 34 years old. I do not know that audience. I don't know the music that they listen to, but you're asking me to come to BET because it's a Black face, and that you think that BET is going to relate better to me, and it may make your chances better in that pitch. When honestly, I can't speak to any of those rappers in the deck because I don't know who they are, and I've never listened to their music. So different things like that have been very, very frustrating to see. And, I challenge everyone in this chat who is not Black or a person of color to be very cognizant of the language that you're using. Same thing with that BET pitch. Like, I remember seeing the deck, and on the first page of the deck, it was like, 2019 is going to be lit. We don't need to put that in a deck when we're pitching BET. Like, we don't need to seem cool. You know what I mean? Like, your work should speak for itself without using, slang terms to connect with them. So definitely be very cognizant about that.
Yeah, and a follow-up to what you said, and I know we're going to talk about, allyship and corporate accountability, but when you've had those experiences, like, have you felt comfortable sharing it? Have you spoken up, or was it something that you were just kind of like, this again, here they go?
I would say in the beginning of my career, I didn't. There's that extra layer that Black people have to wear to work, where it's like, how am I going to be perceived? So I know if I say something, am I going to be perceived as emotional, which has happened? Am I going to be perceived as angry? Am I going to be perceived as, I can't handle the job. I don't have thick enough skin to handle this job because I'm complaining. And I've seen that happen before too, where, I've had companies that I've worked at where if I've gotten emotional about a topic, I was called out on it. And then I've had a white coworker cry in a meeting because she broke up with her boyfriend. and was coddled for that. And so, you know, it's the differences in how that happens. I would say now, because I'm 12 years in the game, I don't give a fuck anymore, and I'm gonna say what I need to say, and I am vocal about how I feel. But I also realize that I have that privilege of being 12 years in the game and having the background and just being able to communicate better, where, you know, when you're younger, when you're just coming out of college and you think you're in what your dream job is and you're in your dream industry of sports and you're going to think you're going to be doing all these cool things. And when these happen to you, you kind of just don't even know how to react, because you're thinking about like, okay, I don't want to seem this way. I don't want them to perceive me this way. I want to feel like I'm just here to do my job and I can do it well.
Yep.
I think that there's a lot there that I definitely relate to. I think that the concept of covering is something that a lot of white people don't understand. The act of covering, when is suppressing a part of you or feeling like you can't bring your full self to work. And that is exhausting. And the truth is that sometimes you might go the full day without seeing another person of color at your job. And you just kind of feel like you've been suppressing part of you. And then in the day, maybe the whole group's going to happy hour. And maybe I don't feel like going to happy hour, right? And just continue to be in this environment. But you know, that's oftentimes, that's being considered not a team player, right? Or whatever. That's how these things manifest themselves. And I think the truth is that if you really start to understand, listen, and empathize with the experience of Black people, and people of color, you'll understand how some of this manifests itself.
Well, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, for sure. Malcolm, you mentioned it earlier, but you know, it's clear that the sport industry profits off of Black talent and culture. But does this industry respect and empower Black people beyond the court or the playing field? And can you guys provide some specific examples? Vince, we can start with you.
You know, I'm really just so moved by some of what was shared before. And I think, Malcolm, you mentioned how exhausting some of the code switching covering may be. I want us to think about how also psychologically harmful it is when you don't have a professional experience that you've ever showed up in a genuine way, because you've always had to try and navigate this space of how much of me is allowed here. Even just that question that you have to stop and ask yourself, how much of me is allowed in a room that I'm about to literally walk into? Like, that's psychologically damning. But to the question, I think sport is a microcosm of society. So unfortunately, the unfortunate reality of our society is that systems that profit off of Black bodies to the detriment of those Black bodies are rampant, and they've been, there's cycles, you know, they renew themselves, they recreate themselves. Sport is no different. I think what does make sport stand out is how visually jarring it is to look on a field and see 70% Black players and look on a sideline and see 90% white coaches. And there's just so many eyeballs on this thing called sport. So I think that's what puts sport in a different category. And so it's almost, we're going into this moment of, you know, creating, again, this concept of accountability. Who's going to be held accountable for that? What does accountability look like with that in existence? And, you know, those are questions that we've not gotten to, but I think this movement will bring to the forefront again. I think that it's less of a matter of Black talent being empowered or respected, and it's more analyzing the system and asking, was Black talent even ever a consideration? Because you'll find, and also the question of just what does Black talent have to do to get respected, right? They exist. You have St. Marshall, who's, you know, president and CEO of the Dallas Mavericks, so exist, but what's the bar? How attainable is it really? And so I think it's more questioning the system and looking at who is this designed for, you know, and then we can start to, I think we're gonna have to shuffle the cards over after that.
Yeah, for sure. Malcolm, how about you?
I have nothing to add. Vince wanted, he told us he was in his bag today, so
China, anything to add or follow up to there?
No, Vince got it.
Vince got it. And as a white woman, it's like completely, it's just, I hope every person on this call who's white or, not Black has taken that, and it's just, it makes you really think and look like this is stuff we have never really experienced in the workplace. So thank you for your vulnerability and sharing that. And, as I said, I gained perspective. I hope everybody else on the call gained perspective from, specifically the Black experience. So now let's talk about corporate accountability, and how that manifests within the company cultures and practices itself in systemic ways. So, diversity inclusion, let's talk about this. That's a term that so many companies use. We talked about it earlier, but really don't put weight into, or just use this as a term to bring another Black colleague in. Do these diversity inclusion practices really help, or are they just, to check a box in hiring, retention, and promotion? Shina, we will start with you on this one.
Sorry. So, yeah, I feel like a lot of companies are, diversity and inclusion, D&I is a sexy term right now. Mm-hmm. Everybody's throwing that term out there, and I haven't really seen the work being done. When it comes to hiring practices, how are we hiring? Because to be realistic, especially in the sports industry, y'all don't have problems or any issues getting Black people to apply. And I've heard that from very senior people so many times, like, well, we just don't have Black people apply to these roles. Or, we haven't gotten any resumes from Black people for the senior VP role. So to that question, I challenge you to think about is, who is your gatekeeper? So if you're not getting the resumes directly, and you're claiming that you have not seen one resume from a Black person for this role, who is sending you those resumes, and how are they analyzing these resumes to figure out who is the best fit for this job? Additionally, we talked about some of these reports that have come out on diversity in the sports industry. I would love to see the breakdown of that, because what we're finding is that, sure, some of these companies are great on diversity, but it's because 90% of the people of color, or the Black people specifically who are being hired, are in very junior roles. And we're not even going to get into people who are being undersold in terms of their roles. So, people who should be at director and VP levels, but are being pitched as, sorry, my lighting is going crazy, but should be pitched, but are being pitched as managers or coordinators because they need to grow into the roles. That is something that I have never heard when it came to a white man. I've never heard a white man having to grow into his role. If anything, I've seen that they've come in at roles that they were definitely not qualified for, but they have the spark that gets them in there. Whereas I remember I had a friend who also works in this industry when she was working with headhunters, and they told her she needs to take the director title off of her resumes because it could be seen as intimidating, even though she's been in the game close to 20 years. So in reality, she should be like an SVP by now. But the fact that she's even still being considered for director roles is insane. And to discuss the internal part, what are we looking at when we're seeing promotions, when we're seeing people who are being fired and let go, when we're seeing people who are quitting? There was this one company that I worked at within the sports industry where it was a running joke that when white people left, we busted out the corporate card to have a cool big happy hour for them. And Black people sort of just disappeared from the office, where, you'd realize after 2 weeks or so, you're like, oh snap, I haven't seen Malcolm in a while. Does he still work here? Let me text him real quick and see if he still works here. And then you text him, he's like, oh yeah, sorry, I got let go 2 weeks ago, or I left 2 weeks ago. So how are we looking at those numbers? When we're looking at the review systems, when people are getting reviews, are there certain buzzwords and keywords that are being used in the majority of the Black people's reviews? Like, they're not ready for this role, or they don't feel comfortable in this position, doesn't ask for help. What are we seeing in those? So I would definitely love to challenge anyone in this room who are in those very, very senior positions, especially if you are not Black or a person of color, to really start to pay attention to those different types of things. If you are at a company and you see that 5 Black people left within 6 months, that is a problem. There's a reason for that. So.
And just to follow up with that, because we've talked a lot about, you know, those numbers and just companies like reporting data, but it's like, if that's plain as day and people can see that, like, why is there no accountability?
Because they're not actually like recording that data. They're making excuses as to why. And, you know, something that I tell all of the younger people that I work with is, you know, keep a record of everything that happens to you at work. Every little thing that may make you feel uncomfortable, may make you feel angry, keep a record of that. Because what's happening is a lot of these, especially in the terms of, you know, people being let go or being forced to quit, because that's something too that, you know, a lot of us see. It's like we're being, you know, pressured to quit. You know, it's this case that's being built up. So it could be just like a ton of smaller things that your coworkers may not be looked at for, where you're being looked at for. So, you know, I've worked in marketing and digital. So we'll say something as small as like, you know, if you work in social, the copy not being correct or something, whereas like your white coworker, it may just seem like a one-off, you know, a one-off mistake where they'll be looked at as like, oh, they must have just been an off day. But for a Black person in the company, that's being recorded. And then when they're pulling up every single day that one of these small mistakes were made, and then that's building up into a case as this person is not competent for their role. Whereas some of their white coworkers are just being seen as they had an off day, or, you know, that's just a mistake. That was a one-off mistake that they made. It's not how they usually are. So yeah, I just don't think that companies are actually recording any of that data or looking at it because they're creating other hard data to, you know, just align with the decisions that they've already made.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you for sharing and elaborating on that. Vince, anything else to add there?
I think just when we think of, you know, coming from the D&I space and having done so internally for a few different companies, I think this is a case of two things can be true, where you can check the box and still create true impact. Let's say, you know, if an organization wanted to hire, we want to hire 10 Black people this year. Well, if you hired 1 last year, then that is hell of movement, right? We just made a lot of progress. However, it's the culture that you're going into that's a lot of times not addressed. And that is where challenges persist. And it's also that the goals are not set as such. You know, I think what ends up happening is that so many different perspectives are brought to the table. And by the time you're done having a D&I conversation, you've talked to legal and you know what you can't do here. And you've talked to, you know, marketing, and they don't really have the needs, or they're on a hiring freeze. And next thing you know, it's like, well, we only have one role, and you know, HR is going to tell you we got to hire the best person for the position. It's like, all right, well, you know, this was an exercise in futility. So I think it's diversity and inclusion roles can and do work. It's what they're empowered to do. Are they actually empowered to come in and look at your practices for how you approach how you approach talent acquisition? Can we analyze that process? Are we able to look at gender pay equity? Is that something that we care to do, or do we just want to look at our multicultural marketing platforms? And I think that's kind of, you know, a continuation of our previous conversation, where if we're moving people from marketing roles into diversity and inclusion roles because their skin tone match the need, are they going to have the expertise needed to know how to actually create pressure and actually create movement for a comprehensive diversity initiative? I think it's something that is possible, but it has to be addressed in an authentic way.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Vince, I think you hit the nail on the head. You know, it goes deeper than just hiring Black talent and people of color. The problems are vastly internal. So I would actually kick it to everybody, but China, we can start with you. But what would you guys like to start seeing?
Yeah, I kind of touched on it before. I would love for these companies just to take a step back and start looking at their own internal practices. Maybe that does take, like Vince said, hiring someone who has these skills and isn't just on the marketing team or the comms team to come in and can really break down what your needs are. I would love to see more people of color getting hired, not just hired, but promoted, and promoted in a timely fashion. So I think someone in the chat just now mentioned, like, you know, the rate of Black people who leave because they've hit the ceiling and they know they're never going to get promoted into that SVP role, these EVP roles. You know, there's no reason why a Black person should be in a director role for 10, 15 years when the average rate of promotion for some of your other employees are 5 years. So that is something that I would really, really like to see, and something that is really that I'm passionate about, is to see that rate of promotion, and not just in revenue generating roles, but, you know, once they're promoted, making sure that these people have the voice to actually do the work, and not just promoting them just to promote them, but actually let them do their job, let them sit in on those pitches, let their voice be heard. You know, Vince, you talked about like the multicultural work. I've worked in the multicultural space and the general market space, where I've seen the vast difference in budgets for that. You know what I mean? Like there was one major brand in particular that I worked with where, you know, in general market, the budget was $60 million. In multicultural, the budget was barely $1 million. And I didn't know how to navigate that space because I started off on the general market side. So when I'm coming up with ideas, I'm like, yeah, but we can pitch them for like 5 million or whatever, because they have that money. They dropped 60 million just on one quarter. And, you know, the team was like, yeah, but we haven't really seen that money from them. And, you know, we don't really want to even ask them for $1 million because they usually don't give us that much. So, you know, when people of color are being put in these roles, like allow them to do the work, allow them to do that general market work, that real work, and don't just pigeonhole them into some of the smaller things that you don't think has as much visibility until some shit blows up. And then it's like, let's just call the Black guy who works in the office so we can see how that person can navigate it. Because then you run into that Black person having the voice of the entire company on their back, and that is not fair. So even in this situation now where, you know, as Malcolm said earlier, a lot of companies are pulling in their Black employees to help them craft statements. That is not fair for your Black employees to have to craft a statement for a $1 billion revenue company that houses thousands of employees, and it's left up to these 5 Black people to craft a statement and be the voice of that entire company. Because if the statement is not 100% correct, that comes back down on them. And that's not fair. You have a comms team for a reason. Make sure you're hiring diverse people in senior positions in that comms team who are equipped and qualified to do this, so you don't have to get that person in marketing to come and start playing PR manager. So those are my thoughts.
Well said. Malcolm, how about you?
I think for me, it's something that I think Vince started to touch on. When you focus on hiring, I think it allows you to ignore issues you already have internally. And so what you don't want to do is bring people into a burning house, right? Like you got to get your own, like if they can't flourish there, it's not going to work. And so at school, we learned about, I was in a class and we talked about the inclusion dial. So with their employees of diverse backgrounds, first they need to feel safe, then they need to feel welcomed, then they want to feel celebrated, and lastly, they want to feel cherished, right? And it's not until they feel that they're valued and that they're empowered, they can really thrive. And I think that you see when it goes right and you see when it goes wrong. At Twitter, for example, Jack Dorsey announced that Juneteenth is going to be a company holiday. Like, you know how proud a Black person feels to get that recognition of something that's widely unknown to a lot of white people. To have that recognition means the world, right? So you know you can show up as your authentic self. Versus in other situations, and I think it's really interesting to see how the NFL has switched within just a few years. But back in 2016, when Philando Castile and Alton Sterling were tragically murdered, I knew a lot of employees of the NFL including my friend Essay that was trying to get the NFL to say Black Lives Matter, trying to get them to acknowledge what was going on, and it was to no avail, right? And so to see that clearly they weren't empowered or they weren't supported enough for those voices to be heard, but then for them to say 4 years later, it's kind of interesting, right? Are they just following the money? Are they following public sentiment? It's hard to reconcile those things. And so I think that first you have to really think about how you value your Black talent and your talent of color, and whether they're actually set up in a position to flourish at the same time that you focus on recruiting, right? You need to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time.
Absolutely. Vince, anything else to add there?
No, I mean, literally could echo that entirely, because that would be what I would hope to see, is for leadership of companies and companies holistically to think how what we see outside, how metaphorically the knee on the neck, how might that be happening in our building? How can you think critically around that conversation? And to Malcolm's point, now how do you address it in your culture? I think it starts with listening, and I hate to say that because, I think Black pain and suffering has been on display for the entire world for so long, and now it's like, in the midst of trauma, here we are having to do it again, and hold on to hope that something tangible comes of it. But actually listening to the experience within the four walls of like hearing the stories like Shina has shared about being looked over for promotion time and time again, or hearing stories like, oh, I actually hired someone 5 years ago, trained them, and now they are promoted over me. I work for them now. I've heard that. And that's like, how do we allow that to happen? And it's right under our noses. And so, I think at a point in time, that ignorance has to be called out. And I just echo Malcolm that we have to think about culturally what needs to change to address this.
Absolutely. I hope there are some decision makers on this call, because you all are spitting game right now. That is racism and discrimination. So what are some forms that you may have seen and experienced yourself? It may shine with you.
Yeah, so I kind of touched on this earlier too. A lot of it to me, it was really just dependent on where I was. You have some places that people are so used to just being the majority that they are just very open with their feelings. So whether it's joking about stuff, like I remember I worked a certain place this summer, the year that Trayvon Martin was killed, in the summer that Michael Brown was killed. And I remember a coworker asking me, why is everybody so mad at that kid being killed in Florida? Don't make it a race thing. Just tell me what happened. And stuff like that really affects your coworkers. Like, it's bad enough that, as a Black woman, I saw a child be murdered, a child who looked like my nephew, who looked like my cousins, be murdered, and know that that could have been one of them. And now I have to not only explain to you what happened because you're too lazy to go on google.com and find out what happened, but also I'm now tasked with making it comfortable for you in terms of not making it a race thing, to just tell you what happened, when at the end of the day, it is a race thing. And then go back to doing my job and making pretend nothing happened. So stuff like that. In terms of institutionalized, definitely, the promotion thing that I've seen time and time again, certain language that you hear all the time of, we don't think you're ready for this role. Or, if you ask for help, even though you're told day one, always ask for help. But when you do start asking for help, being told, are you comfortable in this role? Because we see that you ask for help a lot. Or just use your knowledge. Or I've also heard, we hired you at this level because we expected you to perform at this level. So why are you asking questions? Seeing coworkers be allowed to take time to deal with things, whereas some of your Black coworkers is not, because, you know, their experiences may not resonate more. So, you know, having a coworker be able to take a week off because her and her boyfriend that she met on Tinder broke up and she was distraught. And it's like, listen, I get it. Like, breaking up is a very serious thing. You know, it is, I can't see someone coming to work after a breakup, right after a breakup, and be expected to perform. But let's keep that same energy with everybody on the team. Whereas, like, if someone is saying, like, I had a traumatic event happen to me, I need to take a day, don't email them that day and hit them up and be like, oh, I know you're taking some time, but I need you to check in on this real quick. Or, you know, the next day, expect them to come in and do their job at 100%. Like, if she was able to take a week off to deal with her breakup, which she most likely deserved, then I should be able to take 2 days off to deal with the traumatic event and just breathe for 2 minutes without you being in my inbox, or text messages. You know, I've seen things like that. I remember one time I was on vacation in a country that was known for not having good Wi-Fi, and having someone hit me up in my Instagram DMs to be like, we need you to check this real quick. I'm like, I'm offline. Like, I don't get cell phone service out here. I don't get internet service out here. Like, relax. We're going to be fine. Someone else can do it. We're not curing cancer here. This is not an industry where we're doing anything that's saving someone's life. Like, you don't need my input for that one slide on the deck. There are 4 other people who can give their input and have just as great input as I am. So.
Right. No, thank you for sharing that. Malcolm, what about you?
Yeah, I think the one kind of very public secret and the thing that we kind of ignore in this industry is the impact of wage suppression and unpaid internships. That is a very explicit form of discrimination. And so I think for me, I have a personal example. After my sophomore year, I landed an internship at Octagon, and I was gonna have to move to Virginia to take an unpaid internship. And I had no way of doing it. Fortunately, they had a scholarship program when I applied, and I was the one student that got, I think I got $2,000 for the full summer. And that's what I had to survive on for the summer to pay my rent and everything else. And any money I made as RA and everything else, right? So the fact is that this industry, intentionally, we have prevalence of unpaid internships, underpaid entry-level roles. And because of socioeconomic and systemic issues in the United States, that disproportionately impacts Black and Hispanic people, right? And so how are you expected to get that internship? But for me, I'll use myself as an example. Octagon was my first break into the industry. Without that, I wouldn't have got my internship at the Sixers. Without those 2 things, I wouldn't have got my job in the NBA. And so if you are kind of discriminated against from at the very beginning, and you can't afford to take a summer and not be paid, right? Then you can't get that job, then you can't break in, and then you're out of the industry, right? And then we have this pipeline problem and everything else. Also, with entry level, you're starting at the leagues and teams and everything, and it's really, really low pay because there's so many people that want to get in, and we all know, we've all heard it, right? But the fact is that leads to wage suppression in people that are most privileged and can have their parents pay for them or subsidize a lifestyle, are able to take those roles, then be able to get promoted, and then everything else, right? So we have to acknowledge, again, this is about the sports business, like that is the impact. It's not about the intent, right? Maybe the intent isn't to be discriminatory, but the impact is. So I think we just have to be forthright about that. And as much as we can, and as we advance in leadership positions, question those assumptions, try to find ways to make it feasible for employees to make a living, especially living in the New Yorks and LAs of the world. So I think that's a very tangible example of racial and economic discrimination in the industry.
I also want to break down the unpaid internship a little bit more, because I've had that experience, not only myself, but with students that I've worked with through MIS Next. So when there was one student in particular who I worked with who, took this unpaid internship in New York City. She was coming from a smaller Midwest city. And the reality was she couldn't afford to live in New York. So, you know, me being her mentor, I let her stay on my couch for a month, and then found a friend who was able to let her stay at her apartment for a really cheap rate. But what ended up happening was she had to then go get a second job when her white coworkers were able to only focus on their internship. So, you know, if they even are able to somehow make this work, most of these kids then have to also get another job just to support themselves, which is something I had to do. So you know what that means? That means that when the office is doing office happy hours, she can't go because she has to go to her job. So she can't connect with her colleagues. She can't network appropriately because she's now at work to just pay for the rent just to live in that city. When other coworkers are staying late to work on a deck or a pitch or whatever, she can't stay late. She has to leave at 5 o'clock on the dot because she needs to go to restaurant X to do her work. So what that does is, as Malcolm said, it already puts them behind where they're starting way behind their other coworkers because they're not able to network efficiently. They're not able to put in that extra work that can raise them up and maybe have a company look at them like, oh, we want to hire her full time, because what management is seeing is she's leaving at 5 o'clock on the dot every day. She's not as committed as these other interns. And not even thinking about the fact that, no, she has to go work so she can afford to come do this free work for you.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And not caring at all that you're having somebody do your free work for you and not able to have the same experience as others. Vince, anything else to add?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to high level this for a moment and just like have it be understood that, you know, to Malcolm's point in China as well, with an unpaid internship, these things become institutionalized because everybody's okay with it. Like, there's not many folks who are advocating to get rid of that. Why? Because, oh, I had to do it, and that's how you get grit, and you know, you'll find a way to you'll figure it out. And then it's almost like the fact that I figured it out now actually works against the person coming behind me. But high level, it's just when those systems impact people of color more adversely than people who are not of color, then that's institutional racism. When there are performance evaluations who judge people of color more harshly than people who are not of color, that's institutional racism. So I think it's just bringing it a higher level and just thinking anything in your system that seems to land on people of color more heavily, we have to at least ask the question of, is there institutional racism at play here? And I think that's what doesn't happen. Far too often it's explained away because, there are several other folks who maybe you can even point to metrics and say, well, this is why the performance evaluation went that way. Well, this is what we pay all the interns, and we actually increased intern pay for the last 5 years. Rather than focusing on the question of, does this land on people of color more adversely, and then how can we fix that if so?
And I think it's important to say, we haven't touched on it yet, but diversity, equity, and inclusion is just good business, right? Like we talked, like the fact, if you have more diverse people at the table, I understand we're saying, we're suggesting increasing wages, everything helps improve diversity, right? But also having more diverse people is better for your business. And there's a return on that. In the long term, there's a return on that. And so by having a more diverse perspectives in the room, you're gonna have better ideas, you're gonna have more authentic marketing campaigns, you're gonna have more, the content is gonna be produced by the people that actually have lived experiences, and so it's gonna be more relevant, right? You're just gonna have a much more, just have a much better design. And that's with an industry where the majority of our talent and the players are of color, and then also a lot of the audiences, right? So it just makes sense that the products would be representative, would be designed by people that are representative of the audiences in so many ways and the primary stakeholders. So I think that's just one thing that it would be remiss if we didn't highlight and explicitly state that.
No, thank you.
There are hard facts and numbers that prove that you make more money when you have a more diverse staff. It's like, I forget I want to say it's close to, and Vince, you may know this better than me, it's close to like 75%. companies who have a more diverse staff are 75% more likely to make more money. So if you don't give a fuck about anything else, you don't really care about this diversity stuff, cool. But you're gonna make more money. So it's like, at least fake and make more money.
Yep.
Absolutely. Get better ideas, everything. It's like we talked about with the creativity. It's like you keep things the same and you're going to get the same, which I think we've seen from some of these institutions and how things have continued within our industry and society for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for sure. Want to switch gears into our last topic of the night before we take Q&A, but want to start talking about effective allyship and progress. And, you know, now that we've recognized some of these issues, how can a lot of the people on this call help to change things internally? So let's talk about what allyship looks like. First question, why is performative allyship so dangerous, especially in our industry? And for people that aren't aware of this, it's a term referring to activism that's done to increase one's social capital rather than because of, you know, your devotion to the cause. So, you know, we've seen it. It's a fine line on social media, right? I mean, you want to do things because you want to do them, but do you share them all the time? Is it okay to do it without sharing, all that stuff? So Malcolm, we'll start with you, but you know, why is this such a dangerous thing?
And this is what I'm really afraid of. So performative allyship, what it does is it dilutes the value of the entire movement and the credibility of the entire movement, right? So when you have thousands of people that are performing without having meaningful action behind it, now the ones that are actually intentioned and inclined to act, they can't necessarily break through, or they can't have the impact they wish they had. Or what it allows is people to dismiss the issue. It's like, oh, we did our good deed, we posted our black box, we've kind of done our job here, right? And you've already seen that. My timeline on Instagram is after that Black Tuesday, I haven't seen much more of the protests, I haven't seen much more of the stats, I haven't seen much more of the injustice, right? Everybody kind of washed themselves and cleansed themselves in this kind of this performative act, and they were able to kind of move on with their breakfasts and brunches and everything else that they kind of want to post or consume. And so I think that it's really dangerous for us to miss this opportunity, because what it does is it drowns out the sincere and authentic voices.
Yep. Shaina, how about you?
Yeah, I echo everything that Malcolm said, and to push it a little further, when you're practicing performative allyship, but you're not actually practicing that in your personal space within the office, you are hurting your colleagues. And that's just the bottom line of it. You are stunting their growth, you're hurting them. So it's like, if you're going to be an ally, as I've said earlier, like, keep that same energy across the board. Do not just post the black box on Instagram. Don't just post resources on Twitter or wherever, or retweet a whole bunch of Black Lives Matter posts, or retweet your company's statement and comment like, I'm proud to work here, when, you know, you're dealing with your own colleagues. You're not continuing that sentiment. You're still engaging in those really harmful practices that, you know, harm your Black colleagues.
And you've been, you know, so open and vulnerable, all of you, about real issues that you all have faced and your other Black colleagues has faced. So for those of us on this call, like, what would effective allyship in the workplace look like? You know, you said Shaina speaking up, but what else, you know, would really be effective? Vince, we'll start with you.
I'm going to share a story so everybody get comfortable. So I've always considered myself an ally to any underrepresented group. So I had an opportunity to attend an Out and Equal conference, which is one of the largest LGBT advocacy conferences globally. And I was unaware of that when I went to attend. This was 5 or 6 years ago. So I walk into the room and I am one of maybe 10 people who identify as heterosexual in a conference of about 1,500 people. I could feel myself get uncomfortable. And I even stood up to ask a question at that conference, and I introduced myself, name, title. This is who I am. This is where I'm from. I'm here as an ally, and here is my question. And the reason I share that is because I always considered myself an ally until I was in the room amongst the individuals I said that I was there to support. Then I got uncomfortable. And then when I stood up to speak, I made it a point to introduce myself as an ally. Now, in the moment, I said I did that because I want to be clear that I'm here to support the cause. In reality, I had to reflect on that and say, I wanted to be clear that I'm here, but I'm not one of you. Like, I wanted to let it be known I'm here, but I am not a member of this community. So when I think about, I share that because there's a few concepts I want to pull out. One, it takes intentionality, right? You cannot be an ally on accident. You cannot be an ally just by sheer presence. You're going to have to do something. You should be able to measure your allyship. You shouldn't even try to consider yourself an ally. You should only measure the things that would be considered your allyship. Secondly, is that you have to be willing to reflect. Like, I could have walked out of that moment and said, I stood up and said, I'm an ally because I'm here as an ally. I want to support the group. Instead, on my drive home, an hour and a half from Orlando back to Tampa, I reflected on that moment and I realized that my intention was different, even than what I thought, even from what I told myself. So the other point, so I think those are two things, intentionality and being willing to reflect. The other piece of effective allyship is you can't just be an ally when you're amongst your group. I personally got really upset with Drew Brees this past 2 weeks. Almost even more so when he announced himself as an ally, because you don't get to just say that. Like, you play to not center this on Drew Brees. Your proximity does not determine your allyship. You can grow up around said group and still have very ill thoughts about said group, even though you smile and call them friends. So I think it's putting teeth to this thing called allyship and get away from the labels of I am an ally instead challenging ourselves to prove our allyship.
Very well said.
Very well said.
Yeah.
Malcolm?
Now, I think I agree 100%. Allyship is a journey. And I definitely, I acknowledge, like, there is intersectionality here, and I'm with you on everything you said. I think that allyship also requires people to embrace that discomfort, but also be willing to sacrifice power, sacrifice privilege, right? If you only are an ally when it's convenient to you, you're not an ally, right? If you're only an ally when it doesn't impact you, you're not an ally. And so I think that that's a term that people need to internalize and realize that, all right, I might feel uncomfortable, or maybe my cousin that I recommended for this job doesn't get it. But I'm gonna speak up and say that, like, this other person of color actually is a fantastic candidate. Or maybe I got credit for something that China said. I'm gonna be an ally and say that actually, I think I was just building off of what China said. You know, that's what being an ally is. And so I've seen allies that have said, after, like, in that specific example, after the meeting, they say, oh man, I felt so bad when I think he thought that I said that, but I was just repeating. It's like, but you didn't speak up. You didn't feel bad when you got that shine, right? And so allyship is speaking up when it's hard, and it's also about I think it takes listening, it takes empathy, but it mostly takes action. And the thing that I found really tough to see is that people don't always do all three of those things. They don't always listen, empathize, and act. Sometimes they just act, you know, and I've seen groups of white allies that have started doing things, and I'm like, did the Black people ask you do they want that? Do they benefit from that? Is that, yes, you may post this on the intranet site, which is fantastic. But you ignored all the things they said about the long list and years of complaints, right? There are receipts already, like they're already, you might not have heard this in the past and maybe just now speaking, really listening with intent, but you should be following the lead of the people that are being marginalized in terms of what they need and how they need you to act. And so I think that that's something that allies, it really requires an adept and a great ally to act in the ways that is, which would benefit the people that are really being discriminated against.
Absolutely. And it's not always going to be convenient.
Yep.
China, anything else on, effective allyship?
Yeah, I think what Vince said was very important about you don't get to be an ally just because you said you're an ally. And I think that that is something that we've seen a lot where, you have people who are like, but I'm not racist. And, I volunteer for this organization and I donate here. And, I make my posts on social media and I support you and all the things. But if you don't take a step back to check yourself and check your own behaviors and check your own listening skills and your own thoughts and how you talk to people, then you're not being an effective ally. And I've had coworkers like that who were all about the fight until it came to the fight internally at the office, until it came to like helping me to get to that next level or helping that other coworker to get to that next level, and not, as Malcolm said, taking an idea, or if we're sitting in a meeting and that someone of color has had thoughts on that, but they don't feel safe enough to speak up in a meeting because they may be the only person that looks like them in that meeting and they don't think that their voice will be heard. To say something as simple as like, oh yeah, well, Malcolm and I were talking the other day about this and, he had a really good idea. Malcolm, do you feel like talking about it? Or do you feel like, expanding on that idea or something like that? Those are small, but really, really effective ways that you can be a good ally. So yeah, just honestly, just checking yourself.
Yeah, for sure. So last actual question of the night, and then we'll get to Q&A. But look, now more than ever, we need to empower everyone to be a part of the solution, to listen and to take action. And conversations in the workplace can be a bit different than our conversations in everyday life. And so, Shaina, we can start with you. But what would a productive conversation look like between teams or colleagues in the workplace?
I think the first thing is listening and understanding that just because you've been in this game for 20 years and you may not have experienced this experience and you work for what you think is such a great company and it's been amazing and we're so open and diverse here, just taking a minute to listen to the experiences of some of your other coworkers to figure out how your teams can be better. And, we all know that to make changes at the company level, it's going to take time. There's things that need to be put in place, but even starting on your own teams, making sure that you're empowering people of color, making sure that Black people feel safe to be themselves and they don't have to put on a mask to come to work, and they feel safe enough to share their experiences. So if something does happen, they feel safe enough to talk to you about it and not feel like you're going to be offended and put their job at risk and put their livelihood at risk because you felt personally offended to something that happened. So I think that's listening, and starting small is, to me, would be some of the most productive ways to have this conversation.
Vince, how about you?
I think that right now is such a unique moment in our history that these conversations can actually look the same that they would look at home. I think that if you are a person, if you're a Black person and you feel a lot of emotion around this topic, you should feel empowered to share that right now. If you're a Black person and you feel a lot of emotion and you don't want to share, I hope that you feel empowered to not share it at all. But I think right now is a moment where whatever is in your gut, whatever you feel, you have rationale to express that, because I would say probably 8 out of 10 companies have put themselves in this conversation now. So I didn't even start it. You started it when you released the statement. Like, now the conversation has started and I want to have a part of it. I need you to understand how that feels for me. I think the next piece of that, and this is my shameless plug, y'all gonna have to forgive me. You need someone who can facilitate that conversation to the next level, because the emotions and Black pain and suffering are one thing, but how we're going to address the systems that kind of reinforce that internally are quite another. I can't tell you how I was so hurt that I walk in as a Black man and say good morning to folks and they completely ignore me. I can't tell you that those things happen, and what we need to do is address, well, we need to address X, Y, and Z so that we can be better. I can only tell you the emotion that I feel around it, or at least I should only be responsible for sharing that emotion. Companies need to invest in resources that will allow them to have that conversation, but also have the one that needs to happen next, which is addressing internal culture and addressing racism that is likely present in most businesses.
Mm-hmm. Instead of running from it.
Absolutely.
Asking people to volunteer their time, pay them.
Right.
Yep. Yep. No, well, thank you all for sharing. Extremely open and transparent conversation. We do have some guest questions, and then we want to share with you all some action items that we've all put together. So Paul, if you want to take us into a couple guest questions, we'll go right into that.
Yeah, for sure. So the first one was actually before this, so I appreciate that. But the first question is, as an African-American student, I have aspirations to graduate from college and break into the industry of professional sports. However, it is a lifelong struggle to break down racial barriers and advocate for justice and equality for our people. Sometimes it is rather overwhelming. I am fortunate to learn from Malcolm and how he faces this adversity. Would the rest of the panel like to share how they have embraced this challenge? Shaina, you want to start?
Sure. So I, and kind of like I touched on earlier, I'm at a different space in life right now where my ability to care has gone out the window. But I will say, one of the first things is to realize that this is a space for you. And I know that that is very hard sometimes, because we're taught that this isn't a space for us and we're kind of just a guest in this corporate world. But know that, your shit, and you are an expert at something, whatever that is, and you can talk to that and you can speak to that. Some of the other things that have really, really helped me as well is just finding my tribe, whether that was in the office of having my safe space of group of people that I can talk to and vent to, or even my own platform, Minorities in Sports, where that has turned into a safe space in a community where people can just share their feelings and get advice from other people who look like them. Definitely find mentors. I remember at a lot of my companies, at least 3 or 4 of them, I've been a part of our little Black Girl Magic crew, where it's we are each other's safe spaces. I know that I can put in that group chat, or we can go out for drinks later, and I can really be my whole self without fearing what's going to happen to my job, without being scared to get that random HR calendar invite that says they want to meet tomorrow. So yeah, definitely I would say find your tribe, start to really practice and know that this is a space for you and that you can do this work, and definitely look for some mentors.
The only thing I would add is, connect on LinkedIn and let's start to build that, right? Let's create the network. Let's be sure that you have the outlet. Do not take on the weight of these systems of inequality and injustice and feel like entering this industry, that's your job to fix. Absolutely educate yourself. Absolutely do what you can do within your sphere of influence to be sure that you're combating the issue. but do not accept the weight because it is designed to exhaust you. It's designed to defeat you. But I think Shina said it expertly that you had to have a tribe. And if this is something you care passionately about, then I could probably be a part of your tribe. So reach out, whoever that is.
I think just to add, and I'm not sure who it was, but I think to build on what Vince and Shina said, your obligation is to yourself, and you got a whole network, a whole group between MIS and sports industry influencers, people that are rooting for you, so don't feel like you have to go at it by yourself. I also think that this industry teaches you and trains you and just reinforces to be grateful for what you have. Like you're lucky to be here. Like you're lucky to get this job. Like at the NBA, I was so happy to be at the NBA. It wasn't until like 4 or 5 years later, I was like, wait, I can't actually pay my rent. Hold up. Like, you know what I mean? So like you have to also know your worth and never settle. And if you're in an environment where you're not set up to succeed, or your manager has a bunch of microaggressions and you feel like you can't get promoted, like just know that there are other places, there are other jobs, there are other cultures. For me, I spent last summer at Twitter, and Twitter was a fantastic, very different from anywhere I've been, right? There's tech, there's media, there's so many different sides to this industry in places where you could be better set up to excel. And so just never settle and know your worth. I think it's important to reinforce that because we're repeatedly kind of beat down and taught like you should be lucky to be here.
And be okay with saying no. And I say that cautiously because I don't want, as a young person, for you to be penalized for saying no to certain things. But if it is something that, makes you uncomfortable or is completely out of your scope. So we talked about the example of a lot of Black people being asked to do D&I work, right? Like you can say something as simple as like, you know what, I'm not qualified to do D&I work. Like, my background is in this. I can recommend some people who would be more qualified than me. But, definitely to Vince's point, Vince, he's right here on this call. Connect on LinkedIn, guys. But, to Vince's point, don't feel like you have to put those burdens onto you where you're overextending yourself and then you get burnt out. Because I feel like a lot of us have done that early on in our careers. We want to seem like we are so, adequate and we're just like the best person at this job. And we say yes, yes, yes to everything. And then we end up burning out. And we end up not doing things effectively because we took on too much. And then we're at work every night till midnight because it's like, we didn't have, we weren't able to say like, you know what, I can't really do this. So.
Thank you guys for that. And thank you for the question. We did receive a couple more questions that were submitted beforehand. So this next one, which we kind of talked about a little bit at the beginning, but how do you all think diversity and inclusion will be different now in the sports industry? Vince, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I think that I think what's going to be different for sure is that we're going to have a lot more representation. I would be shocked if I'm not sure what the percentage is now, but I'd be shocked if 50% of professional sport teams across, I'll say the big four, don't have someone who manages this project, this diversity and inclusion project. Now, how they position it is yet to be seen, but I think for sure we're going to see a lot more representation, which is encouraging because one of my beliefs is that the sport industry is full of a lot of smart people. We just have to get them to care about this topic. Once they bring that creative energy to the topic of tackling racism, I think we'll be in a much better place. So hopefully we see the conversation buoy up and we really get leadership across the board, not just people that work in D&I, leadership across the board engaged in this important conversation. I hope that we continue this momentum and we kind of drive into that lane.
Absolutely. Anyone else like to share on that question?
Yeah, I definitely feel like there's going to be, to Vince's point, like a bunch of D&I task force and different things, right? But I think those people have to be empowered. I think when those implicit bias trainings come out, like people need to show up. People need to take them seriously, right? When this wave or movement, if I hope it doesn't subside. If it does, and you have that diversity, inclusion, or implicit bias training in January, February, like your attitude and how you approach that is going to make a difference, right? So if you go in, you say, I'm excited about this, I'm open-minded, I'm going to make the best of it. That's very different, right? If you blow it off, if you skip it, if you have a head count and you skip those trainings, what signal does that show to your workers, right? And that's been historically, that's kind of been what happens, right? The whole department has a DNI or implicit bias training, and the VPs aren't there, the presidents aren't there, the directors aren't there, right? So what signal, if the bosses don't take it seriously, that means it's not valued, that means I don't really need to take it seriously, right? So I think that it's gonna be critical that we continue to keep that same energy as we've been saying, and also empower the people that do take on these roles in DNI. And I think that we all wouldn't be on this call, we wouldn't have organized this event if we didn't believe in the power of sports and the power of this industry to be a driver of society and a driver of culture. There's a whole history of sports being a driver of cultural change. And I think that we should continue to strive for that.
Yeah, I think I'll add to that. I think we are going to start seeing a lot of those be mandatory, especially for senior leadership. It's going to start being part of, whatever trainings that they have to do for their jobs. Because to your point, Malcolm, like I remember a board being at one of my companies being called out on that, where the head of HR was like the only person who showed up. And during their board meeting, she called everybody out and was like, there was not one person in this room who was there. And you guys are the people who need to be in those meetings. So I definitely think that, we're going to start seeing those be mandatory. But I challenge those of you who are attending those to actually listen and be open to what these instructors are saying, because it's one thing to attend, but if you're only attending because you have to and it's mandatory, like, listen, we all do those trainings when we first get hired someplace, right? How many of us have actually taken a minute to actually go through those trainings and understand what they're saying? Or do we just answer all the questions because we have our real jobs to get back to and we're like, the training is going to take 30 minutes, so let me just answer the questions that I know are going to be there. So like, if you are in these trainings, actually sit down, listen, be open, don't be defensive. People are, not coming at you directly. They're not telling you that you are a horrible person, but just be open and listen to the experiences so you know how to better conduct yourself and be a better teammate to your team.
Yeah, for sure. I don't know if you guys can see the YouTube comments, but we got crazy amount of questions. There's no way we're gonna get to them all, but we have a couple in Zoom too. So thank you, Chris, for submitting this one. But he says, I was in emerging media in the Jersey office at the NBA, and being the only black person on my team was very stressful. And daily I had to walk on eggshells and talk the lingo just to fit in. I felt like I had to work 2 jobs while being at work, which you guys talked about earlier. And then he says, but my question is, at my company now, we don't have a diversity and inclusion team. How do I go about holding my CEO and senior team accountable? And what should that timeline be? Whereas they're looking at me to be the lead, but it's not my job.
Of course.
Who wants to go first?
I want to jump in on this one because I've had this conversation countless times in the last 2 weeks. I think what's most important is oftentimes Black folks who are tapped to have this conversation and lead it internally, you're passionate about it. You care. You're probably very much in tune with being a high performer. Like you want to do good work, and you may even want to stretch opportunity, and this might look like that. Take your time, and if you choose to, take your time and build a plan. And at the end of that plan, say that you need to hire someone to execute this. That must be a part of your plan. That can even be step 1 of your plan. And then step 2 is refer to step 1. Like that is how I think that is the most that you should have to do. Now, if you choose to do more, then I think you can let passion guide you. But I definitely would just recommend, if you're either, we need to hire someone full time to do this, or we need to hire someone, a third party, to do this, because I don't think it's just not fair, and it's, in my opinion, it's not going to be comprehensive if it's somebody's part-time job, and I just don't think that model is going to be effective.
Vince, I hope your inbox just explodes after this conversation. So we will.
Yo, drop your email, bro.
Yeah, put it in the chat.
Who's your booking agent?
Right. I'm gonna need one after this, huh?
Yeah. So our next question in Zoom, it's from Miguel, and he said, this question might be a topic for a different time, but I wanted to ask for advice on educating Black international athletes who do not have a full understanding of systemic racism in the United States. How do we begin those conversations with them and prepare them for the difficult reality when they are transitioning to the US? Good question.
I would like to start to touch on this because I am a first generation American and have a lot of family who still lives overseas. I think the first thing we need to think about is, like, let's not assume that they don't understand any part of it. There are Black issues everywhere, and a lot of them are dealing with racism in their own countries as well. Even some countries that, you know, we like to think are super progressive, like, you know, the Dutch colonized my island. So I have a lot of family who lives in the Netherlands. And, you know, a lot of people think the Netherlands is this great, happy, progressive place where everyone smokes weed and they're so open. But really, the Netherlands is one of the most racist countries on this planet. And we don't have time to go into all that stuff. But I think, you know, they may not understand the systemic racism here in this country, but I think, you know, definitely just have open dialogue with them, do some research on some of the racism that goes on in their country and try to correlate that and, you know, talk to them that way. And honestly, prep them. Like, I have one of my cousins is coming to the US to play D1 ball from the Netherlands, and I've already started having conversations with him about, like, you know, these are things that you have to look out for as a Division I basketball player on a majority white campus. These are things, you know, don't put yourself in these situations, you know, the talk that we all have to have as we're growing up, but also, like, giving him the grace to know that he knows what racism is because he deals with that in the Netherlands. Like, he knows what it's like to be the only Black person on his basketball team, or to be called a monkey, or, you know, if anyone's familiar with Dutch culture, to know about that blackface scenario that happens every Christmas and being called Zwarte Piet. So it's like, I'll send you links, Malcolm. Yeah, I'll send you links. But, you know, he sees that because they deal with that. So, you know, I've just been very open with him about examples here and just to how to work through that. So.
That was a good question, and thank you for sharing that.
Oh man, I'm trying to pick another one. There's a lot of good questions in this YouTube. We'll go with Stephanie. What advice would you give to a younger Black employee that acknowledges they are being treated unfairly internally within the office, but also not supported enough to have a voice to speak up?
I have one. I hope this is a part of a lot of companies' kind of call to action or plan. There needs to be both formal feedback loops and also anonymous feedback loops. And it's specifically for situations like this. When someone's vulnerable or doesn't feel safe, if you don't feel safe in your environment, how are you going to speak up? And you know, who's going to hear those? If you don't feel like they'll hear your cries, how are you going to speak up? So I hope that companies actually make it part of this. Pass email extensions or anything where people can submit feedback or experiences and situations anonymously. Or if you don't have that within your company, I've heard of people building anonymous emails, Gmails or whatever, and sending it to leadership, right? Because if you're concerned about retribution or job security.
Oh, I think Malcolm.
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh. We're
Lost
frozen.
one.
Steady Riley Wi-Fi.
It was getting good.
We're getting really good. Okay, you're kind of back.
You're
I'm
back.
back.
That's that.
Maybe not.
Man, we made it an hour 45 with no issues. That's pretty good, though.
Dang, Malcolm.
You gotta fix that Wi-Fi.
I know. Does anyone else want to take that one, or what do you think?
I don't have anything else to add.
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, yeah, I think it's discouraging to hear, and I'm really wanting to provide information that's helpful, that doesn't sound like just keep on going, because I don't. I'm sure you've heard that 100 times. I think this is where a tribe comes in handy. If there aren't those formal or informal feedback loops, then you could be at a crossroad where you have to make a difficult decision. But I think this is also another example of maximizing this moment and taking advantage of the fact that a lot of things are being brought to the forefront, and you can be bold no matter where you are in the company right now. Now, again, it has to fit your personality type, and maybe this is something that you're early enough in your career where you're okay testing the waters, but you can be bold now. My opinion would be that nobody wants to be the company who fired the Black person for speaking up about something today. I mean, I don't think that, I can't guarantee you safety, but I would feel like that's something that's a truth in this moment. So perhaps that's something that you can leverage to just feel like you can have a voice in this moment.
Yep, for sure. Well, look, we want to be cognizant of everybody's time. First off, thank you, Malcolm, Vince, and China for tonight. This was amazing, and I hope that it was super valuable for everyone that was on the call, and super impactful. We don't want this to end with just a conversation. This is just a starting point for us. We want to empower others to take action and hold ourselves and others accountable. So we put together an external call to action as a direct follow-up. We created a link tree with some good resources that I will put in the YouTube comments, and we can send out afterwards. But, I think one of the first external call to actions is, we talked about it a ton, is to listen and to empathize. Talk to your colleagues, talk to your family members, talk to your friends. You got to get out of your comfort zone and be comfortable being uncomfortable. Vince, you talked about it. Everybody talked about it on this call. So, I think that's step one: listen and empathize.
Yep. Thank you, Paul. And I think, education. We talked a lot about this in this group specifically, but to my white and non-Black peers on here, it is imperative that you educate yourself on race-related issues, both, just in our country and in the workplace. I think, our Black colleagues and peers and friends are burdened by the question of what can I do? What do I need? I don't think that's their job. I think it's our job to educate ourselves, continue to be more informed. Like, we talked about a lot of things tonight that may be eye-opening for some of you who haven't specifically looked for it in the workplace. So think about how you can maybe educate yourself on some of those numbers and statistics that we talked about in your company. Take what you learned tonight and educate others in your circle and immediate community. The dialogue that you can have is going to be extremely important.
I think another one is to advocate. And sorry, excuse me for the Wi-Fi situation. I already got Ted Riley jokes in my group chat, and I'm not going to stand for it. But I think that it is incredibly important for allies to advocate behind closed doors. And like we said, not just when it's convenient. How can you use your privilege to fight racial discrimination? That's the only way we're going to close this gap. I think examples of that are, you can advocate by not only mentoring. I heard this quote. It said people of color are over mentored and under sponsored. How can you sponsor someone to get that next role, to get the promotion they deserve, or to get the job somewhere outside the company. If you see the ceiling at their company, use your network. You refer someone to a role that you hear of outside that company, right? How can you use your privilege to help to people of color and fight racial discrimination?
Yeah, and to add to that, kind of the theme of the night is, keep that same energy across the board, sustained action. Not everyone is meant to do everything. And I think that is something very important to think about as well. Like, use your strengths and build on your strengths. So if you are someone who is not a protester, that is fine. Call your representatives. Make, as Malcolm was saying, use your privilege within your companies where you are talking to other senior leaderships to not just mentor someone, but sponsor someone. Use your time to volunteer, to, mentor the next person who's coming up, or do one-on-ones with someone in the office who you feel like has not been the strongest in terms of like speaking up, and kind of really get to know that person and find out why, and apply pressure for change. So I think we've all talked about using our privilege. So making sure that you are using the privileges that you have to apply that pressure for change. And even to some of my Black colleagues in here, recognizing that those of us at the more senior level, that we have privilege too, that we can start speaking up to, say what we feel is wrong, or to even help that person who may just be coming in the door to get to the next level.
And for me, I want to first revisit the kind of what brought us to this conversation, right? Anti-Black racism, injustice, and police violence. I think it's very important that in this moment, especially, that we name the enemy. If we're accepting anti-Black racism is the enemy, then we have to call it that. And racism at large, we have to call it that. I think we've gotten a little comfortable calling it things like unconscious bias, like a microaggression. And sometimes those things can be true, and it can also be racism. And until we get comfortable calling it that, we cannot defeat an enemy that we won't name. And I think that's very important to accept in this moment, not to shy back away from this, and then to really just get engaged in the conversation. This is not a time to be silent. This is not a time to let a difficult conversation push you back into a place of being silenced. We need every voice, and we need everyone involved in pushing forward so that we can defeat the enemy. And that if you find yourself in a place where you're challenged, that's okay. And that's going to happen. But be sure that you show up to the next fight. Stay in the fight. Be sure that you stay engaged in this conversation.
And lastly, self-reflect. I thought, Vince, your story was so powerful. Have there been times where you could have used your voice and you didn't? How can you be a better ally in the workplace? Maybe think of times where you've been ignorant, or things that you've been taught in your life that you can reverse. What else could you be doing? To Shina's point, we all don't have to do everything right now, but we do have to do something. So self-reflect on what is best for you. Because, to change an organization, you have to first start with like the organism. So self-reflect, change yourself. Those are just a few of our call to actions that we had outlined.
I have one add to that, Dom.
Okay.
I gave this piece of advice to a friend of mine, and on that self-reflection piece, document it and write it down. Capture exactly how you're feeling in this moment. Because if you're gonna listen to anyone, it's gonna be listening to yourself, right? So if you write down what your takeaways were from today, if you write it down, what your reactions were to seeing George Floyd die, if you write down, or be murdered, I should say, if you write down all your feelings around this movement, write those down and hold yourself accountable for revisiting them. Because you're gonna remember, that's gonna kind of charge up that battery again and keep you in the fight, as Vince said. So I think as you do that self-reflection, document it, and it's going to be something that you're going to be able to listen to and remember how you felt. Because I think the reality is that for a lot of people of privilege, race is something that they can forget. versus if you're a person of color, you remember that every day of your life, you're dealing with it every day of your life. So just how can you keep that in the forefront?
Yeah, absolutely. That was very well said. And, to piggyback off of that a little, like, for some of us who may have just, woken up, quote unquote, to this, it's like, think of how, exhausted you may feel now, and think of having to experience that the whole day or your whole life. So I think, it's just so important to take these calls to action. In addition to what we have just shared, we're going to be sharing resources and other initiatives that we've put together. I think, collectively as a group, like, we've done some of this work together, and this is not something that just ends with a conversation for us. So please be on the lookout in your inbox in the next week for some things that we are going to share with you and some next steps that we're going to be taking on our end. We're very committed to this as a unit. And Malcolm, you said it so eloquently earlier, like, we work in sports, we work in a very powerful industry. Like, we're all lucky to have the positions that we're in. So let's be a change in this industry. Let's show that we can, stop some of these things and stop racism. And it starts with all of us on this call. So again, huge shout out to our partners, huge shout out to our panelists. We hope that you've enjoyed this conversation, but keep your foot on the gas. Like, this is a marathon, it's not a sprint. You will certainly be seeing more programming like this from us, and you will be hearing from all of us soon. And thank you again. This has been great.
Thank you guys so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Really appreciate it. Hope everybody enjoyed it. We'll definitely see you guys again soon. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Have a good night, Tropicana.
Bye, Tropicana.